Good evening, everybody. Fantastic to see you all here. I've got two hats on. I've got my head of school hat for performance and cultural industries, and with that hat on, I really want to welcome you to our school if you haven't come before, or if you're very well known to us, an equally warm welcome. But my other hat is as a professor of theatre and performance, and I was lucky enough to have a period of research leave last semester between September and February. And this is my moment of accountability, I feel. I was very well looked after, and the school was brilliantly led in the interim by Scott Palmer. So I have a big thank you for Scott looking after that period, and the rest of you who were prepared to do without me. And now I can share with you what I discovered in those 6 months. I'm going to manage expectations. I timed this yesterday, and it's 59 minutes. So if you don't like long lectures, find a discreet way out. But I'm filling everything with lots and lots of beautiful images, beautifully directed by Kerry. I'll say that in a minute. And then we'll have some chance to share thoughts, questions, etc. So welcome and thank you. Clocking the view from Arthur's Seat, some methods to map mountain culture. It's a beautiful view, undoubtedly. One which tens of thousands of people have clocked since Arthur's Seat became a popular viewing point at the beginning of the last century, subsequently being augmented with interpretive aids like this bronze view indicator first installed in 1910. Many thousands more will have flocked to this tiny urban volcano thanks to its most recent memorialization in the Netflix series One Day, starring those dazzlingly youthful actors Ambika Mod and Leo Woodall. It's a beautiful view, but I confess it's one I've yet to witness. I've been on a number of summits in my time. Perhaps notably, I've climbed all 214 of the so-called waymarks in Cumbria, and another 115 of the same summits so far on my second round. A family pastime which morphed into an AHRC research project, a new piece of performance, and a 90,000-word book. But this view, and all of the forthcoming ones in this lecture, are constructs, imaginations, recreations, though no less valuable for that, I hope. The second half of my title implies there's something valuable to share in this lecture beyond the spectacular panoramas of Scotland. And I'm going to try to do this in the first section, the mountain as methodology, outlining some of the steps I've taken to draw analytical as well as content-based inspiration from mountains. These come both from the Mountains monograph I've just mentioned and from a recent long chapter I collaborated on with postdoctoral researcher Prof Pitches for the forthcoming Routledge Companion to Scottish Literature. Kerry has also attended brilliantly to the illustrated part of this lecture, putting all of the images together for tonight. Many, many thanks for that. So before we tour the Scottish borders, highlands and islands, let me reflect for a few moments on matters more abstract and conceptual, on how topography can stimulate methodology. The central theme to the following examples is the belief that constraining structures can be generative, yielding otherwise unforeseen insights. This was undoubtedly true for the work I undertook on mountain plays in Performing Mountains. For this chapter, Mountain Drama, I developed a geographically inspired methodology for sampling, necessitated by the overwhelming complexity of the corpus. I needed to bring some kind of order to a sample of over 120 plays. I did this by mapping a selective range of mountain dramas longitudinally, in the geographical sense, taking the play's mountain locations as the starting point, scanning their lines of longitude from the Western Hemisphere, Peru 78 degrees west, to the Far East, Japan and Eastern Australia at 150 degrees east. Once drawn, these dramatic lines of longitude produced the following pairings, which in their writing out offered surprising and thought-provoking connection points. Confronted with these pairings, produced by arbitrary lines of longitude, helped me understand the plays at two levels, in relation to their individual dramatic concerns, but secondly, the wider dramaturgical picture. Eleanor Fuchs helped for the former, specifically her idea of a play world. This play world has its own climate, seasons and time, she tells us, and these undergo change during the play. Thinking of a play as having climatic conditions which inevitably shift over time seemed a highly appropriate method of analysis for mountain plays, allowing emotional content, for instance, to be understood meteorologically rather than psychologically. In relation to the wider dramaturgical picture, this longitudinal sampling approach forced the consideration of the connections and disconnections between plays, helping me to identify unforeseen patterns. It allowed me to ask what I thought was a bigger and perhaps more important question. Is there a distinct practice we might call mountain dramaturgy? To do this, I drew on Cathy Turner and Sina Bernst's notion that dramaturgical analysis regards the performance as a complex web of elements and aims to identify the ways in which they connect and fail to connect. And to answer that question, I had, I think, 6 findings drawn from a cross-continental survey of 11 mountain plays, and here they are. Mountain dramatists shape their plays in response to the topographical details of their chosen site. Mountain literalism on stage is best avoided. Don't be a mountain naturalist. Mountain plays harbour spirits, magic makers, gods and demons. Miraculous things happen in them. Mountain dramas trade in ambivalence, defining places of nurture and destruction, of power and impotence, of sacredness and secularity. Mountain plays engage in wider critiques of male tropes of heroism, for instance. And mountain plays express a deep and prophetic concern for the mountain's health. The idea of a mountain-led methodology also helped me to map what I called the critical landscape of mountain studies and mountain performance. Just as with that extensive, complex corpus of mountain dramas, the theoretical and disciplinary context of mountain studies is extensive, complex, and fragmented. How to make sense of it? My approach was to model the disciplinary strata associated with the study of mountains as a mountain itself. And I used the Mountain Research Initiative database as the source of these disciplines. As you can see, this disciplinary mountain has its foundations in geology, implying that the science of mountain formation, orogeny as it's known, forms the bedrock of mountain research. As we ascend, we move into other territory: ecology, human health, behaviour, technology, sport and leisure studies, and finally, historical and cultural representation. Climbing this metaphorical mountain takes us from the physical geography of mountain processes to the human geography and anthropology of mountain behaviour, and finally, via the use and development of technology, to the remediation of mountains through cultural production. That uppermost layer of this peak, where perhaps we might find a symbolic cairn, is my subject today, but all the other layers are present in the shadows. To place cultural practices precariously at the top is not, I'm afraid, a misleading representation. The Mountain Research Initiative, MRI, for instance, states unequivocally in its principles that mountain researchers are like the mountains themselves, scientifically, culturally, and generationally diverse. But in practice, the extent to which artistic knowledge and cultural production forms part of that thinking is limited. Just 4% of over 2,500 researchers listed in the MRI identify art, folklore, symbols and language, which is their disciplinary category, as an interest. And even these researchers are almost entirely from social science and science backgrounds. Hard science is undoubtedly the loudest voice in mountain studies, irrespective of the cultural turn having spread across the social sciences. It's a familiar story for those working in interdisciplinary research. Cultural understandings are broadly recognised as playing a vital, significant part in landscape and place-based studies. The interconnectedness of the challenge in relation to climate breakdown is often cited, and the power of narratology and of storytelling, so often acknowledged as a fundamental tool needed to cut through politics and economics. But culture remains precariously balanced and is too often the beneficiary of lip service by other players in these strata. I said earlier that the peaks I would be referencing this evening were constructs or recreations rather than felt entities. And this won't ever be truer than for my next set of examples, drawn from research conducted last semester for a chapter titled A Probable Course, Fabricating the Case for a Great Mountain Literature Way. This is going to be published in the Environment section of the Routledge Companion to Scottish Literature. The brief was to work against genre and against period. And one creative way to achieve this was to appropriate the importance of the long-distance route, LDR, as an organising principle. And I did this by drawing inspiration from one of the most celebrated of all literary routes, created by Robert Louis Stevenson in Kidnapped. A little digression to Stevenson. When Stevenson's iconic lead character, the shipwrecked David Balfour, finally realised that his island prison on the west coast of Mull was unlocked twice a day by the movement of the tides, he set off on a punishing and perilous 230-mile walk back to Edinburgh. Crossing some of the most recognisable mountain regions in Scotland, through Glencoe and skirting through the Ben Nevis Range, he could never have conceived that one day people would do the same, walk in his very footsteps for pleasure. The creation of the Stevenson Way, as it's been formally known since 2012, benefited from some precise cartographical pointers in the original story. Indeed, Stevenson carefully constructed Davies and his companion Alan Breck's route in the famous preface to the book, beguilingly marking the certainties and uncertainties of their journey. Quote, "On the large map, a red line is to show the wanderings of my hero after his shipwreck. It must be sometimes dotted to show uncertainty, sometimes full. Thus, the probable course of David Balfour's wanderings was set down in black and white and red, the blueprint of what is now more prosaically called the long-distance route." The Stevenson Way isn't a typical LDR. Most of them are created through consortia of walking enthusiasts, local authorities, national government and invested businesses, and have in turn generated some notable writing, mainly of the guidebook genre. With the Stevenson Way, the literary output, Kidnapped, obviously came first, nearly 130 years earlier. But the precedent it sets, where literature leads the map-making, is a helpful one, I think, to address one of the principal questions I'm asking in this lecture. Where are the key sites of Scottish mountain literature to be found, and how does one navigate between them? Mountains have inspired literature in Scotland since the earliest folklore and mythology. Like its neighbour to the east, Scandinavia, its mountains are populated by giants and demons, inspiring both ancient literature and contemporary creative writing. For a country luxuriating in mountain landscapes, the breadth and depth of their influence are hardly surprising, but this diversity adds to the difficulty of arranging a body of relevant literature for the general readership of a companion. To complicate things further, mountain literature covers a very broad range of genres and forms. Poetry, drama, fiction, all of them feature strongly, but they need to be considered alongside travel writing, narrative non-fiction and specialist mountaineering literature. Again, the question of how best to organise such a complex and expansive corpus is raised. So to address this, I decided on a few constraining principles. First, the mapping of relevant literature must be mountain-led, alighting upon key literatures dictated by topography rather than their place in literary history or genre. Second, relatedly, there would be no hierarchy of literature type, either implicit or explicit in the analysis. Third, that the avoidance of genre or period would spark enlightening and novel juxtapositions based instead on place affinities. In the Cairngorms, for instance, Nan Shepherd's The Living Mountain and the new nature writer Anna Fleming's Time on Rock come together. Or in the Assynt Mountains, Norman McCaig's poems of Assynt rest alongside 784's docudrama The Cheviot, the Stag and the Black Oil. Rather than attempt a dry and ultimately impossible national survey of mountain literature, I assembled a series of what I called waymarked geocultural associations, designed to prompt reflections on the impact of sight on writing and equally of writing on sight. And here's how I did it. In Chris Townend's World Mountain Ranges, Scotland's mountains are divided into 7 areas. You can see them here. These ranges, with some small adjustments, provided the framework for mapping the associated literatures. I will walk you through the associated literatures, and I'll walk you through them in a moment. So far, so good. But more challenging is defining mountain literature itself. What are the key characteristics or categorical criteria for a work to be considered mountain writing? Does it have to be set solely in a mountain environment? In my previous writing, I tried to address this question in relation to mountain plays by drawing on theatre criticism. Mountain drama, according to Catherine Brisbane, and her assessment of playwright Patrick Wright's work, is writing where mountains are as animate as the people who inhabit them. It's a definition which can be extended beyond drama to embrace other forms of literature and can be productively stretched further to ask, what animates the mountain writer? Are they, the writer that is, like the Highland sheep and cattle which populate mountainsides, hefted to the landscape, as writer and shepherd James Rebanks has admitted he is to Cumbria? Or is the mountain writer a tourist, visitor, observer, commentator? Perhaps neither is true, or at different times in their career, the writer migrates between these roles. These are questions of emplacement and embodiment, and I'll come back to them at the end. For now, let me pin the map in the Scottish borders, the shrine where our hearts keep returning wherever our feet may be led, as poet William Henry Ogilvy described the region. The land north of England and Scotland's steeply inclining borderline is home to a number of hill ranges and boasts the country's only coast-to-coast long-distance route, the Southern Uplands Way, carving its way from Portpatrick in the west to Cockburn's Path in the east. These hills, rising to the height of 843 metres in Merrick's case, are the geological residue of the Caledonian orogeny, a 420 million-year-old coming together of Scotland and England, which squeezed out the Iapetus Ocean and left its fossilised sea life strewn across the southern uplands. The landscape is diverse, perhaps more so than is generally recognised for southern Scotland, with the rugged and wild Galloway Hills in the southwest, contrasting with the rolling and relatively diminutive peaks of Lammermuir, southeast of Edinburgh. The urbanised ex-volcano known as Arthur's Seat, rising dramatically in the heart of the capital city, is also included in this region, all 251 metres of it. It may not be of notable stature, but Arthur's Seat provides an enviable view of the surrounding mountains, as we've already seen. This panorama is subject to a detailed historical and personal examination in Kellen MacInnes's guidebook and memoir, Caleb's List. MacInnes was diagnosed with HIV in the late 1990s, just when new drug treatments were being pioneered, and survived AIDS-related cancer, developing a career as a writer and a historian. The book weaves the author's own story of living with HIV, together with the biography of early mountaineer and geography teacher Caleb Cash, the deviser of what is now known as the Arthurs, a list of all the visible peaks over 300 metres, looking north from Arthur's Seat. There are 20, all told, ranging in height from Dumyat, 418 metres, to Ben Lowers, 1,214 metres. And MacInnes uses this list, first published in 1899, to structure his book, offering a cultural history as well as a guide to climbing each peak. It's an uplifting and resolutely positive book. From somewhere, he says, came the idea of climbing the Scottish mountains visible from Arthur's Seat. I could survive HIV/AIDS, I could weather the storm, I could climb the mountains on Caleb's List. And that's, of course, what he does in that book. The furthest sighting from MacInnes's viewpoint is of Ben Dearg, near Pitlochry, on the brink of the Cairngorms National Park, 69 miles north. South of the Seat are the Galloway Hills, big, bulky, burly hills with broad shoulders and long arms. These are the setting for John Buchan's much-adapted adventure novel, The 39 Steps, providing the majority of the novel's locations and, like Stephen's Kidnapped, featuring in a prefatory map charting the hero Richard Hannay's passage through them. Buchan was steeped in the border region, holidaying as a child in Broughton near Biggar, and he passed on his zest for the area, barely concealed, to his leading character. Choosing Galloway as, quote, the nearest wild part of Scotland from which to escape both the British police and 3 murderous German spies, Hannay is uplifted on his arrival into Galloway Station. It had the strangest effect on my spirits. I might have been a boy out for a spring holiday tramp instead of a man of 37 very much wanted by the police. To lose his pursuers, Hannay doubles back to skirt the peak of Cairnsmore of Fleet, further invigorated by the landscape. All the slackness of the past month was slipping from my bones, and I stepped out like a 4-year-old. But as the German enemy gains on him, the high plateau transforms from being a liberating landscape to one which has not cover in the whole place to hide a rat. And Hannay despairs at being found exposed on the mountaintop. Buchan thus uses the Galloway Hills as a barometer, an altitude meter of Hannay's peace of mind. But despite the relative highs and lows, Hannay always retains control of the narrative and landscape. He enjoys free passage across the Galloway Hills and dominion over the people and machinery he stumbles across in the region. Innkeepers, road menders, politicians, trains, bicycles, motorcars. As has been noted of the film version of his character, Hannah's agency is a function of his class and his racial identity. He carries the authority of the hero with him, a hero who is a product of imperial history and imperial right, Angela Davis argues, assuming the same right to adventure over the terrains of London and Scotland. The Highland boundary fault, still active and causing earthquakes, stretches from the Isle of Arran in the west to Stonehaven in Aberdeenshire in the east. It marks the beginning of the Highlands looking north from Connick Hill on the banks of Loch Lomond, and provides, quote, a remarkable contrast in topography between the Highlands to the north and central lowlands to the south. This is the area known as the Southern Highlands, encompassing the Trossachs National Park, the Arrochar Alps, beautiful Loch Katrine, and further north, the Bridge of Orkney. The Central Highlands have two of the country's most recognisable mountain features. The highest mountain in the United Kingdom, Ben Nevis, and perhaps its most beautiful valley, Glencoe. Merging with the Southern Highlands in the south, the region stretches all the way up to another of Scotland's defining faults, the Great Glen. Both regions have stimulated significant literary works. The Trossachs are a historical case study in literature-inspired tourism, begun 200 years before the formulation of the Stevenson Way. While Walter Scott's writing inspired middle-class travel plans across Scotland, no region saw a more dramatic transformation than the Trossachs, after the publication of his narrative poem, The Lady of the Lake. Indeed, it was the very specificity of the mountain references in the poem which led to such an increase in footfall. The integrity of location never more intensely evoked than in The Chase, Canto 1 of 6, with Scott using the conceit of a deer hunt to cant around the local area. The stag ultimately shakes off the hounds and its hunter, James Fitzjames, to disappear safely down a darksome glen in the deep Trossach's wildest nook. Scott's disorientated hero then takes the path of Trossachs to Loch Katrine, manoeuvred into the domain of the Lady of the Lake by the topography of the region. The stag is the mouthpiece for Gaelic poet Duncan Ban MacIntyre's most celebrated work, In Praise of Ben Durain. MacIntyre lived a generation earlier than Scott and was born in the Bridge of Orkney Hills, 2 long days' walk north from Loch Katrine, along what is now the West Highland Way. Known affectionately as the Glen Orkney Bard, much has been made in later criticism of MacIntyre's singularly objective and descriptive approach in his poetry, set to the tune of a pibroch and originally recited to an amanuensis, as he had no command of writing. Poet and writer Gary Mackenzie has noted the relatively unmediated access it gave to the phenomenal world through its combination of orality and unsentimental observation, suggesting that Ben de Rain exhibits an early kind of environmental awareness. Moving through the poem with this sensibility, the sharpness of MacIntyre's naturalistic vision, shaped perhaps by his time as a forester in the immediate region, is striking. The hind is in the forest as she ought to be, where she may have sweet grass, clean, fine-bladed, heath rush and deer's hair grass, herbs in which strength resides and which would make her flanks plump and fat-covered. A spring in which there is abundant watercress, she deems more sweet than wine and would drink of it. Sorrel and ryegrass which flourish on the moor she prefers as food to rank field grass. Animal behaviour, botanical details, plant species and the movement of water stand in place of expansive descriptions of the mountain. 200 years before Nan Shepherd, there is an instinctive and resolute resistance either to reach or describe the summit. W.H. Murray, perhaps the most celebrated of Scottish mountaineer writers, climbed his first routes in the 1930s from a base in Glasgow. His writing about Ben Nevis, from his classic first book, Mountaineering in Scotland, penned famously whilst he was in captivity in the Second World War, typifies his audacious attitude to the challenges of winter climbing. His style in this book, rich with cultural references and wittily chosen metaphors, never assumes an insular, codified knowledge of climbing, using instead a much wider palette of images, often taken from the arts, to translate his experiences on rock. In one passage from the chapter Slav Route Ben Nevis, Murray cuts through the machismo regularly associated with route descriptions, using ballet, poetry and drama as touchstones for communicating what he calls the epic quality of a great route. Murray concludes with an inspired image of climbers in the mountain haze, pulling back his focus away from the cliff face to take what today would be a drone's eye view. When the cloud locally thickened, we appeared at times like the most insubstantial of wraiths, drifting through the shifting mists like wolves in a Russian melodrama. The view of Ben Nevis as a two-sided, two-faced mountain features explicitly in recent poetry stimulated by its heights. In what now sounds like a rather dated metaphor, mountaineer poet Hamish Brown sees Ben Nevis as the harlot, a mountain of loveless loveliness, attracting, quote, brash boys to test their nascent lusts. The poem laments the many deaths born of ignorance, rapid weather changes, and a precipitous summit masquerading as a plateau. It charts its abuse at the hands of, in his words, so many cold hundreds who have pissed against the cairn. The contrast with Duncan Ban MacIntyre's bucolic coexistence with the hinds of Ben de Rain could not be more marked. Formerly known as the Red Mountains, after their pinky granite geology, the Cairngorms only became known as such in the early 19th century, taking their collective name from the single peak Cairngorm. 50 miles due east from Fort William, the Cairngorms National Park is home to the 5 highest mountains after Ben Nevis, including Ben Macdui and Breiriach. Yet the area is better thought of as a series of rounded plateaux rather than a collection of separate peaks. And given the scale of land above 800 metres within its borders, its flora and fauna are part of an ancient Arctic biome. Dominating this landscape in literary terms is the novelist, poet and eco-critical writer Nan Shepherd. Writing in the 30s and 40s, she wasn't recognised as the latter in her own time, but since the rebranding and reissuing of her landmark love letter to the Cairngorms, The Living Mountain, in 2011, academics such as Samantha Walton have positioned her work at the head of a tradition of critical new nature writing, transgressing into traditionally masculine genres and pursuits. This transgression is achieved by a simple but radical realignment of priorities in Shepherd's account of the Cairngorms, taking inspiration from the topography of the region. The plateau is both environment and ethos for Shepherd, ensuring all the region's rich diversity of flora and fauna, human and non-human beings, is treated, respected is a better word, on the same level. She does this in 12 short chapters, taking us from its geographical features, lochs, cataracts, corries, through its elements, water, frost, snow, air and light, to its plant, bird and animal life. Only by the time we reach chapter 9 are the human actors in the mountain range considered, in a series of lively and witty character studies infused with the textures of the landscape already described. Maggie Grewer, for instance, is, quote, that granite boss, shapely in feature as a precipice. And James Downey, so stern that, quote, the grandeur of the corries had invaded his soul. These are, in Shepherd's estimation, personalities bred of the bone of the mountain from families who have lived nowhere else. The final 3 chapters, Sleep, the Senses and Being, move things onto a different plane of existence and celebrate the gently disrupted perception Shepherd pursues in the book to walk into rather than summit the mountain. Sleep is the portal to that displaced mode of perception, gifting the outdoor sleeper an intimacy with the surroundings which can be carefully cultivated. There is an art in waking on the mountainside, she says, because wild creatures and birds come close to a sleeper without suspicion. Training herself not to flinch on waking, but simply to open her eyes motionlessly, Shepherd enjoys the privilege of close relations with the Cairngorms fauna, blackbirds, finches, crested tits, and recalling Duncan Ban McIntyre, the mountain deer, both red and roe. Shepherd's view of the deer is subtly different though. Waking just 10 yards from a red deer, literally on the same level as the animal, she is prostrate and vulnerable, in sync with its rhythm and communication. Why did I let him meet my eyes? He's off, but not for far. He checks in his flight and eyes me again. This time I do not look at him. After a while, he drops his head and, reassured, goes on feeding. This state of humility and Shepherd's gently articulated resistance to and evolution from masculine tropes of mountaineering, the systematic conquering of high mountains, has exerted a powerful influence over writers and artists since The Living Mountain's first publication. Scottish-Algerian poet Janet Ayachi has a dazzling kaleidoscopic response called Translating the Transcendental Mountain, commissioned by the Scottish Poetry Library in 2022. In a stream of associations and fast-flowing images, Ayachi moves lithely between Shepherd's immersion in the Cairngorms and her own inspired, it seems, by the multi-sensory relationship Shepard has established with the mountains. I've been the woman who listened to the stream in surround sound, stereoscopically dumbfounded until she no longer heard her own heart pulse. The female experience of the Cairngorms is consistently juxtaposed with the male in this poem, the former following in the footsteps of Shepard, priestess and quiet pioneer, is looking for unobtrusive isolation in the landscape, a deep entanglement. The latter, in Ayachi's rendering, seeks satisfaction in physical challenge, in summiting or mounting the peak and, quote, by making it somehow measured. The last section of the poem extends this logic, expanding Shepard's personal transcendence to a gendered and political transcendence for all women. Nan, arm in the arm with the mountain, not interested in the summit, but the effect it has on her. Nan's transcendental mountain is where all fierce women, when in nature, must seek to flow. Dance practitioner and researcher and studying in the University of Leeds in PCI, Simone Kenyon's dialogue with Shepard has been through live performance. Into the Mountain was sited on the mountainside near Glenfeshie. The piece took Shepard's final state of walking out of the body and into the mountain as a prompt for a large practice research project, entirely made up of women creators and contributors. 3 guided routes for a mobile audience were conceived from 2 through to 6 hours, converging to a common performance site and facilitated by ecologists and dance artists working alongside mountain leaders. Quotations from Shepard's text were used directly by each expert to prompt the kind of displaced lateral thinking she herself pursued in the Cairngorms, through sleeping, shifting viewpoints, and trance-like long-distance walking. Climber and nature writer Anna Fleming has been inspired by Shepard's bodily engagement with the mountains around her, and she lends this embodiment a lively and contemporary reality with her own account of climbing on the plateau, including the route named Salamander on a baking dry day. Like Shepard, she uses a tactile sensitivity in describing the landscape. You can see that tactility in the quotation there. Fleming shares something in common with Ayachi and Kenyon as a group of women responding to Shepard's work 80 years after it was conceived. The connection point, I think, is in the ethics of engagement and the spirit of an egoless appreciation of nature with its multiple interconnections. Shepard's writing, Fleming states, helped me to steer another course in the mountains, away from goal-orientated mentality and towards the revelation that her craft of climbing is, in her own words, a way of feeling the landscape. Crossing the Great Glen Fault, the near fatal wound in the Scottish landscape carved by Lochs Linney, Lochie and Ness, takes the traveller to yet another diverse set of mountain environments, the Western Highlands and Northern Highlands. From the most westerly point on the UK mainland, Ardnamurchan Point, up to the Kyle of Lochaush and its bridge over to Skye, the Western Highlands are basically a dissected plateau, streaked with sea lochs and fast-running, quick-filling burns. Wild remoteness characterises this part of Scotland, extending to the Northern Highlands, which comprise every acre of mountainside north of Lochaush and includes some of the most unique, beguiling and mysterious mountains in the whole of the United Kingdom. Sulven, Kunak, Canisp, clustered in the Assynt region and surrounded at sea level by multitudinous lochans. Spanning the two regions is the fearsome unofficial Cape Wrath Trail, Britain's toughest long-distance walk, stretching from Fort William to Cape Wrath and cutting through some of the most prominent areas associated with the Highland clearances. In the chapter Land of the Left Behind, guide writer, walker and new nature writer Patrick Baker deals directly with the Ardnamurchan Peninsula's clearance history, seeking out the deserted township of Borblage, nestled underneath the southwestern slopes of Ben Hiant. Baker's writing exemplifies how narrative non-fiction has developed in recent years. His prose slides between the sharply experiential, through unpretentiously poetic observations of the natural world, to precisely located marker points rich in place-made histories. He leads the reader into a kind of kinesthetic empathy for the landscape. We sense by proxy the bond Baker feels between the location and its layered histories. Geographical specificity is used persuasively to make this bond resonate. And here he is talking about Ardnamurchan. Perhaps it was the abruptness of my viewpoint or the immediacy of the scene. The sight of so many ruined buildings scattered across the hillside stunned me in a way I had not expected. I felt shock. Touring the islands in 1973, John McGrath's Cayley play, The Cheviot, the Stag and the Black Oil, co-created by the political popular theatre company 784, brought the painful history of Highlander exploitation and subjugation directly into the town and village halls of the region, reaching as far north as Kinlochcabe. The play famously dramatised three of the strategies used by landowners and multinationals to capitalise the country: Cheviot sheep farming, deer hunting and oil extraction, with Highland mountains providing an ingenious and enduring backdrop by virtue of designer John Byrne's mobile set, an enormous hardback tome. The cardboard cutout background is given voice in the play by a continuing refrain, James Copeland's "These Are My Mountains." And in a moment we'll play you a little strain of that just to give you a slightly different vibe. These Are My Mountains is a kitsch pastiche in Brown and Innes's critique, embodying a range of sentimental motifs about Scotland, its notoriously romantic mountains, and exploiting the emotional sense of exile of the Scottish diaspora. See what you think. Copeland was a man of many talents. He was a theatre, film and television actor, a public speaker, a writer and poet, a one-time continuity presenter for Grampian TV, and a scholar with particular expertise in the work of Robert Burns. A popular folk song beyond its use in Cheviot, These Are My Mountains is rhythmically identical to one of Burns' most popular songs. Let's have a listen to it now.
For fame and for fortune I wandered the earth. Now I've come back to the land of my birth. I brought back my treasures, but only to find that less than the pleasures I first left behind. For these are my mountains, this is my glen, the praise of my childhood will know me again. man by the road sings.
The songwriter's standpoint, though, couldn't be more different. Where Copeland's subject is welcome back to the Highland Mountains, kind faces will greet me and welcome me in, Burns' figure is exiled, distant and melancholy. My heart's in the Highlands, my heart is not here. My heart's in the Highlands are chasing the deer, chasing the wild deer and following the roe. My heart's in the Highlands wherever I go. Like MacIntyre and Shepherd, the deer is a key symbol of Scottish mountain life for Burns, but one shorn of its immediacy and naturalness. As Carol McGuirk has observed, the deer and the roe are not being described but remembered in this song, Burns' song. It is memory, not landscape, much less wildlife, with which Burns is chiefly concerned. Primary teacher, pacifist and poet Norman McCaig has done much to carve out a special literary identity for the Northern Highlands, particularly the Assynt Mountains, keeping his connection with the region alive with summers spent in Lochinver, travelling from his base in Edinburgh. Perhaps because of his willingness to tour schools across Scotland and his long-lived place on the secondary education curriculum, but more likely to do with his sparse accessibility as a writer, McCaig has enjoyed national literary hero status since his death in 1996. His favourite mountain was Sulven, a twin-funnelled sandstone supertanker, often shrouded in mist and floating like a ghost ship above the Lochan pockmarked area of Inverpolly. Like many of the mountains in the region, it is long and thin, with an airiness about its summit which hits the climber abruptly. In what is widely recognised as his first definitive collection of poems, Riding Lights, McCaig finds a simple and startling image to convey his shock exposure in the poem Climbing Sulven. His own shadow. I nod and nod to my own shadow and thrust a mountain down and down. Between my feet a loch shines in the brown, its silver paper crinkled and edged with rust. As he reaches the Bealach between the two summits, the delightful counterintuitive direction of the poem, going down and down, is echoed in the second and final stanza. I claw that tall horizon down to this, and suddenly my shadow jumps huge miles away from me. In a later collection in the poem called No Accident, Sulven and its surroundings are worthy of worship. It opens the space it lives in and heavens revealed in glimpses. In less adept hands, the impression would be mawkish or sentimental, but McCaig swells his own conception into folkloric territory, imagining the two mountains coupling and producing a litter of tiny Sulvens. Mythos meets the matter of fact in these Assynt works, and the mountains of the region seem permanently shadowed by his poetry ever since. Months before he died, McCaig threw a challenge at the mountaineer writer and fisherman Andrew Gregg, hooking him into a 4-day angling expedition and a new writing project, which 14 years later was published as At the Loch of the Green Corrie. Gregg had built a relationship with the poet over many years, absorbing his sharp, generous and elliptical advice as he grew himself into the craft of writing. Corrie fuses Gregg's own memoirs together with a warm, deeply respectful account of McCaig's life and times, including selected poems. If Nan Shepherd is inextricably connected to the Cairngorms despite living outside of the region in the suburbs of Aberdeen, McCaig's poetry, his only form of creative writing, is inseparable from the Sutherland area. Assynt was his heartland, the core of his inner life, Greg muses, although he lived and worked in Edinburgh for all his life. His final chapter, A Late Return, amongst other things, reflects on the writer-writing landscape and on what constitutes writerly authenticity. Greg's answer, evident throughout the Loch of the Green Corrie in his own writing, echoes his master in its direct, powerful simplicity. When his noticing eye fell on a landscape, a loch, a friend, a collie, a tattered rose bush, his child heart would give them their true size and value. Only love can fairly hold and comprehend it. Last section, thank you for your patience. The islands. Stretching all the way up the jagged west coast of Scotland are the names of towns whose significance belies their size and defies their remoteness. Ardrossan, Oban, Mallaig, Ullapool. These are the mainland ferry ports which serve the Firth of Clyde and the Hebrides, twinned with equally memorable names on the island themselves, at least for those whose livelihoods depend on the sailings. Brodick on Arran, Craignure on Mull, Armadale, Skye, Stornoway, Lewis. Taking these ferries and hopping on to onward connections unlocks yet another varied geography of Scottish mountains, with 7 islands endowed with peaks above 600 metres. The islands are home to some of the most notable and notorious mountains in Scotland, the Paps of Jura, Goat Fell on Arran, and the inaccessible Pinnacle and the Black Cuillins on Skye. The latter located on a ridge of such imaginative power, it has, in Anna Fleming's words, drawn in countless dreamers and visionaries, from visual artists to poets, musicians, photographers and writers. Fleming lists the litany of literary figures visiting the Hebrides as pioneering travelogue writers of the 18th century. Walter Scott, Alfred Tennyson, James Boswell and Samuel Johnson. Boswell and Johnson travelled to the Western Islands together in 1773, following in the footsteps of naturalist Thomas Pennant, whose fieldwork for the study A Tour in Scotland and Voyage to the Hebrides was conducted in 1772. Pennant arrived on Skye on July the 17th of that year, the sea smooth as a mirror, disturbed but by the blowing of 2 whales. Passing up the Sound of Sleat, he eventually moored near the island of Scalpe, the next day climbing the nearest peak to his lodgings, Ben Nachailich. From that vantage point, he took in the vista, clearly moved by the sight of the Black Cuillins, looking over the outlayer Blavan towards what he calls the Mountain of Cuchulainn. The prospect to the west was that of desolation itself, a savage series of rude mountains discoloured black and red, as if by the rage of fire. Johnson and Boswell's mountain enthusiasms were altogether more muted, and there is the starkest contrast between Pennant's voyage to the Hebrides and Johnson's A Journey to the Western Isles of Scotland. The latter account often striking a note of grating privilege and condescension. The effects of habitation among mountains, according to Johnson, make their communities thievish and warlike, commonly savage and exercising primitive manners and speaking a primitive language. A schoolteacher on Skye and then Mull before working in Edinburgh, the Rassay-born poet Sawley MacLean did much in his life to counter the marginalisation of his chosen creative language, Gaelic, including campaigning for its full status to be recognised at secondary level. Steeped in Scottish Gaelic culture from childhood, MacLean was politicised on hearing the history of the clearances and the protest songs of the Skye poetess Mary Macpherson. He retained a lifelong affinity with the mountains of Skye and drew consciously on them for his stock of creative imagery. He says the Cuillins naturally became a symbol of difficulty, hardship and heroic qualities. It was a fascination. That fascination was given the fullest possible expression in MacLean's formidable epic, The Cuillin, a 10,000-word dream poem about political commitment, written in an intensive period of creativity through 1939. Though its political axis between the horrors of European fascism and the virtues of international socialism may now be historic, his own belief in the Soviet Union vanished contemporaneously. MacLean's visceral rendering of the Cuillins, wrought from his time on the ridge, remains striking, even in English translation, with its deafness to the sound and music of the original. In the opening to the poem, part 1, the memory of climbing in the Cuillins is fresh and vital, the importance of the mountains to him in no doubt. My place above every other place, to be on your high shoulder blades, striving with your rocky great grey throat, wrestling with hard-peaked, surging chest. MacLean's physical connection to the landscape, foot on shelf, finger on little edge, chest to boulder, mouth to jutty, then yields to a startling image of the ridge as an ossified ocean once he gains the skyline. The great dim sea of gabbro waves, knife edge of high narrow ridges, belt of the dark steel surge, an ocean whose welter is tight in rocks, its yawning mouths permanent in narrow chasms, its spouting everlasting in each turret, its swelling eternal in each skir. Far from romanticising the view, MacLean sees this vantage point as the woeful history of the lovely isle, lamenting the forced exile of its communities during the clearances and the loss of its indigenous people. From these heights, MacLean then sees beyond Skye, beyond Scotland, to the macro world of the poem. Spain and Italy, France, Germany and Britain, all submerged in the mire. The world's ills, as MacLean sees them, are a giant morass, a conglomerate metaphor of world war, bourgeois exploitation, poverty, international capitalism, threatening to drag the poet and the world down. But just as the imagined view from the Cuillins has revealed this sorry state of affairs, so MacLean in the final part grants the mountains of Skye the power of redemption, their elevation empowering them and by extension the micro and macro worlds of the poem to rise from the mire, beyond misery, despair, hatred, treachery, beyond guilt and defilement, watchful, heroic, the Cuillin is seen rising on the other side of sorrow. A very brief conclusion. Coming down from the north in the slave ship The Covenant, Robert Louis Stevenson's David Balfour enjoyed similar views of the Hebridean mountains to MacLean and Pennant. In chapter 10 of Kidnapped, the great stone hills of Skye are framed for Davy by the door of the officer's roundhouse, foreshadowing the harsh environmental conditions he is about to experience on his way back to the lowlands and Edinburgh city. Balfour's final destination, Edinburgh, takes me back to the beginnings of this lecture and its interest in structural conceits. In this instance, a hypothetical long-distance route, what I'm calling the Great Mountain Literature Way. Like Stevenson's map with its broken lines, dotted to show uncertainty, there are unknowns, dead ends, and fiendish gaps in this journey. The chapter this lecture draws on references only a third of the sources of Scottish mountain literature scoped as part of preliminary desk-based research, a sample dictated by the topographical segmentation I've described today. What is lost and what is gained by this approach? To skirt around this question and to recapitulate the aim I established in the introduction, that is to compose a series of waymarked geocultural associations, artist and poet Alec Finley's definition of the term conspectus, I think, is helpful. Conspectuses are viewpoints where the terrain opens itself to the viewer, where the eye can thread in and out of the circle of hills, where place names suggest a narrative sequence, offering the possibility of beginning to know where one is. Thinking through the implications of Finley's promise that these views may be linked together to suggest a narrative sequence, and with inspired deference to the many prefatory maps mountain literacy seems uniquely to encourage, here is a concluding map, charting a probable course through the Scottish literary mountain landscape. This long-distance route methodology for mapping mountain culture may then be added to my earlier longitudinal and geological approaches. Granted, the terrain is too extensive to offer a singular conspectus, but it is punctuated by some memorable viewing points, places to pause, take a breath, take one's bearings, and look ahead. Thank you. I said it was 59 minutes. It might have been slightly longer, but thank you for your time. We have drinks outside, which are arriving about now, but I'm sure there might be one or two questions that come out of that. I hope there are.
Basic question. Do you have a sense after all of this of what constitutes a literary mountain? Because evidently it's not to do with altitude.
No.
It's still but it's way below do that.
Indeed.
And equally, I get the sense, for instance, the monolith hasn't generated any literature at all because it's featureless and uninteresting.
Yes.
So what is it subjectively that makes a literary mountain, do you think?
It's a great question. I mean, I suppose what I would conclude from the research that I've done is one that intensifies literary activity, one that it has a particular set of unique characteristics about it that draw in that kind of creative energy. And it was quite interesting quoting Anna Fleming. I was going to even stop in the middle of the lecture. She identifies the Cuillin as doing that, the black, the ridge, as having a kind of unique natural drama that pulls in the sculptor, that pulls in the fine artist, that pulls in the poet, the novelist, and the new nature writer. So I probably what happened in terms of this research was what bubbled up with those mountains that had naturally encouraged that kind of intensity of creative work. But inevitably, I'm sure there would be debates and arguments about whether one's left out some great stuff. Thank you. Maria.
Hello, thank you for this. I'm really interested in the methodology you're putting together, and I wonder if if you are aware of any comparisons with people doing something similar with other formations, like I'm thinking about islands or sea or lakes, or whether you've been inspired by someone doing something similar, or whether we can be looking for a kind of a trans-geographical or transdisciplinary methodology.
Yeah, again, lovely question. I think the inspiration for this very much comes from alighting on these wonderful maps in the prefaces of so many books that, in various different creative ways, provide a kind of analogue of the experience of what you're about to read. And I got very drawn into that, and then I found I found some of the website material associated with the Stevenson Way, which unpacked the EU funding landscape that sat behind its creation, and indeed behind another Stevenson Walk in France. And what was being emphasised there was the importance of culture as being a central part of the route. So it was those two things. It was the idea that clearly routes aren't just of getting from A to B. They aren't just that it's easiest to go across the pass. They have a whole set of other cultural connections to them. And then looking at this idea of the maps that seem so commonly to come up in good mountain literature. What I haven't done is share that methodology much. In fact, it's helpful to do this lecture because it's made me think about what I was doing in Performing Mountains, which was partly pragmatic. It was partly how do you make sense of all of these plays, and how could you, how can I justify it by only picking 11 out of 100? But I do think there's some interesting methodological implications, and there's scope to comprehend that a little bit more, or think through that a little bit more for me. Any others?
I'm interested to know how and if your sort of performance lens has shaped your approach to looking at literature, because I can remember reading The Living Mountain and being struck as a sonographer by how Nan Shepherd talks about the landscape in a very spatial, sensory, storied way, and whether off the back of writing Performing Mountains, that's kind of shaped your approach, and then as a performance scholar. Yeah,
without a doubt, very nicely observed. I mean, what came through. I read The Living Mountain again as part of this research. I probably hadn't read it as deeply for Performing Mountains. I probably hadn't lived with it, I confess, and I sort of came back to it and found elements of it that really resonated in new way. And it was about that idea of embodiment. And then looking at Simone Kenyon's work as well, which of course, is taking that very literally. So I suppose it's that performative element, the experiential element that comes through my performance lens, and maybe the narrative as well, maybe that idea of storytelling. I very much like. We've lost the sort of ridiculous walk, all 878 meters. I don't think there'll be a story to that other than pain and misery. But the shorter walks, absolutely are about narrative as well as about landscape. So yes, those two things as a first point. Campbell.
You talked about STEM having a kind of louder voice in the context, and I'd just be interested in you articulating how you think this methodology and this research might speak to that louder voice.
Yeah. I mean, as I was speaking those words, I know there's lots of interdisciplinarians in the room, and whether it's a bit of a simple trope to continue to decry the size of the voice of arts versus STEM. I mean, it's an old argument, isn't it? But I certainly found good data in terms of the Mountain Research Initiative to back that up. I mean, what I've been saying in many fora in relation to that question is this: if there's a methodology to what we've just observed, it is about properly valuing the experiential, the sensory, the tactile, and maybe the narratological. So that kind of wonderful makeup that comes with a performance knowledge. And how on earth could we not bring those sorts of sensibilities to the table without being persuasive in debates with our STEM colleagues? And certainly, I'm sure you'll have experienced this, in your networks. In the room itself, when you're talking about research projects and you're talking about things that you might do together, that sensory, experiential, felt range of things that we bring, the understanding of immersion as well, is super valued. It's when we get beyond the sort of room conversations, it seems to me, and when we're into the research council tussles, that it becomes more problematic. So I would hope there's something in here which raises up the productivity of thinking landscape through. Certainly, some of the examples are about embodiment and experience. Others not.
Perhaps a rather dull question. It's thinking about your single, although quite convoluted route, and whether or not there's merit in thinking about a series of linked routes. I'm thinking about Robert Macfarlane's The Old Ways, and thinking about how you might develop this into themed segments.
Yeah. I think that's a really, really excellent observation. And of course, the chapter's written like that, and you don't need to move seamlessly from one region to the next. And there is a kind of discretion, there is a kind of intensity, coming back to that first question, in those different regions. Certainly I felt it very strongly writing that section. The Cairngorms as well, that sort of cluster of really exciting creative productivity. And the Trossachs as well. So maybe it's a bit more diffuse across the islands. I really struggled with that first section in the southern uplands, partly because there was so much going on, but an awful lot of rhetoric in the history as well. So people claiming, ownership of that particular area. Scott being one of them, and me going through a whole deep and dead end ultimate for about a week, trying to find the locus of a particular poem that he'd written, which was meant to be in the borders, but clearly wasn't. It was based much further north. So I found that area a bit more diffuse. But yeah, that would be good. And having written this, I should say, I was in a workshop with all the other chapter writers for the Routledge Companion, and started yarning with some of them. And one of them put me in touch with the president of the Stevenson Way, who now wants to construct elements of the Stevenson Way as a set of vignetted performances, which sounds absolutely fantastic, although that bit across Mull looks so utterly miserable and is really, really tough. I don't know whether I want to do that bit, but so yeah, I think thinking things into those sections sounds like a really good idea. I think we've all earned a drink, unless you've got one final question. That's very, very lovely of you to come. Thank you so much, and hope to see you for a few more minutes in the bar. Thank you.